So, what is greedflation, and what role is it playing in the higher prices that we're all paying today? What do you think, Zach?
Well, that is a great question, Paul. Well, first of all, let's talk a little bit about what inflation is. I guess we should probably unpack that a bit. So, we generally measure inflation here in the United States. We measure it again. There's a common economic term for it in the United States. We measure it by something called CPI, which is one measurement. That's the one you get talked about a lot. That gets published a lot by the Bureau for Labor Statistics, gets talked about in all the press. There's actually something else called CPE, which we'll talk a little bit, or PCE, I think it is. So let's talk about those two terms. CPI is it's consumer price index. It's the idea of measuring like a broad basket of goods. What do they cost? And then you compare what it cost to a year ago or last quarter or some other interval in time. And you say, how much did it go up or how much did it go down? And you measure that in a percentage. And I don't have to tell anybody listening to this, it went up a lot during the pandemic. So at one point you were paying a certain price for eggs. And then 6 months later, you might have been paying twice as much for the same amount of eggs. You could put that against gas. You could put that against your clothing. Another place where there was a lot of inflation as we came out of the pandemic was in goods and services, like at your restaurant or your cost of buying an airline ticket. All of that is measured by the CPI deal. So U.S. inflation has been high. There's no doubt about it. It's been high across a pretty long interval of time. I will say that one of the things that happened with inflation is for a really, really long time, it was really low. In fact, people really worried that inflation was too low. It used to bounce around 2%. Sometimes it would dip below 2%. There was a long period where economists and people at the Fed and other people that are worried about monetary policy, they wanted more inflation because it was really, really low. Here's the deal. Inflation is actually good. It means that there's more goods being produced. There's demand in the system. You've got money. You want to spend it on stuff. There's a certain amount of inflation that is good, and being too low really says that something's wrong. It's stagnant. The economy is not growing. Your wages are not growing. Your demand is not growing. But then we got the pandemic. We shut the economy off. We never shut the global economy off and turned it back on before. And when we turned it back on, there was all of these disruptions. There were supply chain disruptions. There were spending disruptions. I don't know about you, Paul, but I spent a lot more on takeout food than I ever did before. And I spent a lot more on streaming services than I ever did before. So There was all kinds of things that we were spending money on that we had never spent money on before, or in a completely different way. And when we did that, it just made a lot of funky things. So there was a lot of inflation inside those numbers, which is to say the price of something was going up against what it used to be. And the biggest part of that we all knew was supply chains, which is we used to have goods being shipped to the United States, often from China, but other places in the world. Then they would get distributed across the country into stores and warehouses, and it was all very easy to get. It was all really well designed, except it was extremely fragile because when you turned it off, it was really hard to turn back on. And those fragile supply chains made it so that goods were not making it. So the supply of those things was way down and demand was high. And that created this crazy imbalance where people were paying way more. So that was what was happening in the beginning. You asked about greedflation. Well, here's the thing about greedflation. Basically, we do know that corporate actors in particular and businesses writ large, they were using this inflationary moment to drive record profits. So they knew you, Paul, were willing to pay more for your eggs. And so they said, well, gosh darn it, if they're willing to pay twice as much for their eggs, what happened if I just add another 20% on top of that 100%? Nobody will notice. And it turns out mostly people didn't notice. And the folks who really covered it the most were economists. They made all kinds of excuses for the better part of 18 months that there was no such thing as corporations taking profits in this inflationary environment. They tisked people. They made fun of them, literally made fun of them. There is no such thing as this greedflation. But it turns out there may be something to this. Paul, what do you know about this?
Well, I think it's also important to mention that not only did economists say that greedflation didn't exist, they were trying to blame it on workers' wages. They were trying to say
That's
that
right.
our growing paychecks were driving up prices, and in fact, that's not the case at all. The actual contributing factor is this greedflation. Now, you might ask, how do we know this is going on? And the answer is that it's happening right in front of us. In fact, a lot of CEOs in their quarterly reports were bragging about the fact that even if their sales were down, they were raising prices, and the consumers were willing to absorb those prices, or were expecting to raise those prices because the media was promoting inflation stories at the top of every news hour, and so they were taking advantage. They were jacking up prices at a level they've never seen before, and they were also taking home profits at a level that they'd never seen before. You didn't see that in the 1970s when inflation went sky high during Richard Nixon's presidency and during the Carter administration. So it's a clear sign that there's something fishy going on here.
Yeah, I love it because I'll tell you, the pushback on greedflation from largely economists and the people that carry their water in the press has been, there's no such thing. Corporations won't do this, blah, blah, blah. But then, as you're saying, the corporate people themselves, they have to do these earnings calls. If you're a public corporation, one of the things you have to do is you have to release your earnings and you have to release your books. That's part of being the trade you get for being a publicly traded company. You get a lot of protections, right? You get a lot of protections. You get a really stable regulatory environment. You get to draw a ton of cash into your business. Those are but in trade for that, we get a lot of views into your books and your behavior. And you then have to talk about what the hell happened this last quarter. Well, it turns out you don't have to go very far. They themselves are bragging about how they are making record profits because consumers are willing to pay more money because of inflation. They're telling you straight up that this is what is happening. So if you see people pushing back on this greedflation, let me be really clear. It is absolutely real. And we know it's real because these corporate CEOs and CFOs and others who are doing these public displays, they are talking about it publicly in their readouts about what's going on with their profits. It's absolutely attached to the fact that they are raising the cost of things rather than lowering the cost. They're raising the cost. They're not trying to save you a buck. In fact, they're trying to make more money off you in this moment. Thus, the greedflation. There's a lot of things they could have done in this moment. They could have paid their workers more, which many of them did. But of course, they could have helped lower your costs in this moment. Instead, they raised the price of the goods and they profited a lot more during this period. But here's the way I know, Paul, that this is real. I'll tell you how I know. Because the Wall Street Journal is defending greedflation. That's when you know it has become a real thing. Let me read you this headline. Wall Street Journal, greedflation is real. All right, there it is. That's all you need to know. They are fully admitting greedflation is real. But let me finish the headline. And probably good for the economy.
Yeah, there it is.
Let me tell you, this fits right in there with tax cuts for the rich are good for the economy, right?
Yeah, it's absurd. That column is just bonkers because the suggestion, the reason that they say that greedflation is good for the economy is that it's kept corporate profits high at a time when inflation is high, which is, sort of a dog chasing its own tail here for one thing. For another thing, we know for a fact that those corporate profits have not, trickled down to anyone. Those corporate profits go up to the top and stay there. They don't circulate through the economy in the form of wages or consumer demand or anything like that. They get shipped to offshore accounts and turned into mega yachts, which don't stimulate the economy very much at all. So it's a real moving the goalpost moment. It's a real sort of covering your behind moment. I think I can't imagine the writer of that piece felt very good about themselves when they published that piece. It's so obvious. It's so obvious.
Yeah, it's incredibly obvious. All right, Paul. Well, here's the one thing. What do we do about it? That is the big question, right? This is what everybody wants to know. Well, first of all, I do want to point out that there is a lot of truth to this greedflation. We all admit it. The Wall Street Journal's writing about it. It's absolutely a thing that is happening. But secondly, we do know that part of the system here is designed, these companies are designed to raise profits. There's no doubt about it. This is the way that this particular market system works. But it works this way because we set up rules that make it work this way. There are a lot of rules that we could put in place that could help prevent this. First, you have to admit you have a problem. That's the most important thing. For a long time, for the last 18 months, 2 years, there was no admission broadly. In fact, there was complete denial from economists, the center-left economists, the trickle-down left. People like Larry Summers denied this, of course, many, many others. And, of course, the center-right economists and the Wall Street Journal in particular denied this for a really long time. Now there's a lot more admission that this is happening. So you have to admit you have a problem. And secondly, we have tools at our disposal to figure this out. Probably the best tool, and the tool that was used actually during the Great Depression era and into the war, was to prevent price gouging. And one of the most important ways they did that is they taxed the hell out of price gougers. And they just said, well, we're going to measure, we're going to set a mark to define gouging. And if you rise above that mark, you're going to get taxed a lot on those, because we want to prevent this kind of gouging. And we basically see this greedflation thing is a form of price gouging. There's no doubt about it. This is well beyond their normal profit taking. This goes well beyond a normal balance of supply, demand, goods, services, and you get to take a cut off of it. This is way beyond that. So that is absolutely one. The other thing that we could look at is changing some of the rules about what they do with stock buybacks, because during the same period that they are gouging you, the consumer, and taking record profits to them, the stakeholders and C-suite folks, they're also buying their own stock to continue to boost that. So they're taking record profits, plowing it into stock buybacks, which just basically helps all their shareholders, including the executives. Paul, do you have any ideas on either of these things?
Well, I think it's interesting that we're talking about, we're looking at prices in a way that we haven't for 40 years, right? Because for 40 years, economists have been under the mistaken impression that the free market just sets prices at their perfect level, right? And that prices are never higher or lower than the market will allow, that the invisible hand sets these prices. And now, obviously, we have proof everywhere you look that this is not the case, that they are raising prices simply because they can, because corporations have consolidated so much that they're in a lot of places, as we've seen with eggs, there's nowhere else to buy eggs from. There are only a handful of egg producers and distributors in the country. So I think it's interesting that these price control questions are on the table as to whether you can raise prices above a certain level if your profits are 10% higher than normal, things like that. And so I think it opens up a whole lot of interesting conversations about what the market can and can't do and what government's role is in the market, because we already have price gouging controls in place for situations like emergencies, right?
That's
we
right.
have, we saw in Katrina that there were laws against raising the price of bottled water when people didn't have access to clean water. And so you could argue that this is just happening on a global scale right now, in which we had this supply chain emergency and people were taking advantage of it. They were raising the prices simply because they could use this disaster of the COVID shutdowns as an excuse to raise prices. So I am really interested to see where we go from here, because I think it opens up a lot of interesting conversations about how government interacts with the market and provides guardrails for consumers in times like this that are sorry to say the word, but unprecedented.
Yeah, I think the most important thing here is almost everything that happens in the economy, it does not happen like the weather. It's not some mysterious force out there that's a natural phenomenon. It's almost all designed by rules, designed by policy, and sometimes designed by the absence of rules and the absence of policy. That's part of what's happening here. So we have to put different rules in place to prevent this from happening, design different policies. I think, Paul, one of the things that is really interesting about this moment, there's a lot of conversation about that. You pointed out a few things that could be applied here, preventing price gouging in times of emergency. We could think about changing some of the rules around stock buybacks. You could absolutely think about a taxation on price gouging, which we had previously. And I think there's other types of scrutiny that could happen. One of the things that would be very useful as a watchdog role is looking at this kind of, really inflated greed that's happening during times of high inflation. There could have been a lot more spotlight on that from our government watchdogs, which really it took outside actors looking at the data to raise this. A lot of the inside actors were not focused on this. Now, mind you, in their defense, they were trying to get us out of a global pandemic and a catastrophic economic collapse. But one of the things that I think this whole thing points to is the importance of outside independent actors observing this kind of phenomenon, not accepting received wisdom from Larry Summers, the Wall Street Journal, but actually giving a hard critique of what's going on.
So to sum up, to answer the question, what does greedflation have to do with U.S. inflation today? The first and most important thing to know is that it is happening. It is not in your imagination. Prices are going up and people are making a lot more money off of those rising prices.
Yeah, it is real, folks. And you don't have to take it from us. You can take it from the Wall Street Journal. They're telling you greedflation is real. The funny thing is the trickle downers will tell you that this greedy corporations gouging you for profits is good for the economy and you shouldn't buy it. This is bad for the economy. It goes straight into executives' hands, shareholders' hands. It should be either going to reducing the price that you're paying for your goods, or it should be going to wages to those workers. But instead, greedflation only ultimately benefits the same rich, greedy people it always benefits. Trickle-down economics always benefits. So it's real. The Wall Street Journal knows it. They're telling you it's good for the economy. It's not good for the economy, and we've got to work on fixing it.